They let me walk out in February. No coat. No goodbye. Just the sound of the deadbolt turning behind me. I stood on the front porch of the house I grew up in Mississauga. And the cold hit me so hard, my eyes watered. I told myself it was just the wind. I was 31 years old. 8 weeks pregnant. And my parents had just told me I was no longer their daughter. It hadn't even been a dramatic argument. That's the part that still gets me. Even now. There was no screaming. No throwing things. My mother sat at the kitchen table with her hands folded and said, very quietly, "We didn't raise you to do something like this." My father didn't look at me at all. He just stared at the wall behind my head, like I was already gone. And then he said, "You should find somewhere else to stay." That was it. I drove to a Tim Hortons on Ontario and sat in the parking lot for 45 minutes. I didn't know where to go. My apartment lease had ended 2 weeks earlier, and I'd moved back home temporarily while I figured out my next steps. The timing, looking back, could not have been worse. I had maybe $300 in my checking account. A 2014 Honda Civic, with a crack in the passenger side mirror. And a pregnancy I hadn't planned and didn't know how to feel about yet. The father was someone I'd been seeing for about 4 months. An accountant named Derek who wore nice watches and talked about himself in a way that I'd mistaken for confidence. When I told him, he nodded slowly, said he needed some time to process, and then stopped returning my calls. I got one text. 9 days later. "I don't think I'm in a position to be a father right now. I hope you'll understand." I read it 3 times. Then I put my phone face down on my desk and went to make tea. Because I didn't know what else to do. So there I was. February in Ontario. Homeless. Broke. And alone. I called my younger brother, Callum, from that Tim Hortons parking lot. He was 27 and lived in a 1-bedroom apartment in Hamilton, about an hour away. He worked in IT support for a logistics company and made decent money, but nothing extraordinary. He had a pull-out couch and a small kitchen and a cat named Biscuit who didn't like strangers. He picked up on the second ring. I tried to explain what happened without crying. I made it about halfway through before my voice gave out completely. He didn't ask questions. He didn't tell me it was going to be okay. He just said, "Stay where you are. I'll come get you." He drove out in the snow, loaded my 2 suitcases and a box of kitchen things into his car, and brought me back to his apartment. Biscuit hissed at me from the top of the refrigerator. Callum made eggs. We didn't talk much. Around midnight, he set up the pull-out couch with clean sheets and a blanket that smelled like fabric softener, and said, "Stay as long as you need. I want to tell you that I had a plan. I want to tell you that I was strong and certain, and I knew exactly what I was going to do. But the truth is, I spent the first week mostly lying on that pull-out couch, staring at the popcorn ceiling, and trying to figure out whether I was actually going to do this. Have this baby. Be someone's mother. Do it alone." I kept coming back to the same thought, which was, I don't have any other choice that I can live with. So I decided. I was a licensed practical nurse. I'd been working at a long-term care facility in Mississauga for 3 years before the move. And I transferred to a position at a hospital in Hamilton within 6 weeks of landing on Callum's couch. The pay wasn't going to make anyone rich. I was starting at around $52,000 a year. Which sounds okay, until you factor in Ontario taxes and the cost of living, but it was steady. And it had benefits. And I knew how to do the work. What I didn't know how to do was everything else. Callum slept on that pull-out couch for 11 months while I took over the bedroom. He didn't complain once. He installed a little shelf on the wall, so I had somewhere to put my things. He started buying the kind of groceries that were better for pregnancy, without saying anything about it. I noticed that the chips disappeared, and there was suddenly always spinach and orange juice in the fridge. When I had my first ultrasound appointment, and the hospital was across the city, and I didn't want to take the bus, he drove me, and sat in the waiting room, reading a fishing magazine. And when I came out holding the little black and white printout, he looked at it for a long time and said, "She's got your nose already." We didn't know it was a girl yet. He was just saying that. But he was right. As it turned out, my daughter was born in October. I named her Nora. The labor was long and hard, and I did most of it alone. Because Callum wasn't allowed past the waiting room and the hospital policy at the time, limited support persons due to the tail end of some lingering restrictions. A nurse named Patricia held my hand through the worst of it and talked me through the breathing, and at one point, when I was convinced I couldn't do it, she leaned down and said very firmly, "You're stronger than you think. I've seen stronger women than you, and I've seen weaker ones, and trust me, you're going to be fine." I don't know why that helped, but it did. Nora came into the world at 4'17" the morning. 7 pounds and 2 ounces. With a full head of dark hair and her father's eyebrows. Which I chose not to hold against her. Callum was in the waiting room for all of it. When they let him in, he walked over to the bassinet and looked at her for a long time, without saying anything. Then he turned around and I saw that his eyes were red and he said, "She's perfect. Claire. That's my name. Claire. Claire Walsh." I texted my parents a photo. Just the one. No message. Just the photo. My mother read it. I could see the read receipt and didn't respond. My father didn't even open it. I put my phone away and focused on the baby. The first year was the hardest. I'd gone back to work at 10 weeks because my maternity leave topped out at what EI would give me 55% of my insurable earnings, which came to just over $560 a week. And that doesn't go far when you're trying to save up for a deposit on your own place. Callum wouldn't take rent money from me, and I fought him on it constantly. But he was stubborn in that quiet way he has, where he just shakes his head and walks out of the room, and the conversation is over. Nora went to a daycare 3 days a week, and Callum watched her the other 2 days. Rearranging his work-from-home schedule around her naps, without being asked. He learned how to do her hair. He figured out that she only fell asleep in the car if you played a specific playlist. He called it the Nora Emergency Mix, and he kept it saved on his phone for the hard nights. I saved every dollar I could. I picked up extra shifts when Callum was available to watch her. I sold things I didn't need. I ate a lot of rice and frozen vegetables, and tried not to think too hard about the life I'd imagined for myself at 25. Which had looked nothing like this. My parents were completely silent for 2.5 years. Not a call on Nora's birthday. Not a Christmas card. Nothing. I told myself it didn't hurt. I got fairly good at believing it for stretches of time. And then one Tuesday in May, Nora was 2 years and 7 months old. Able to say full sentences, and obsessed with a book about a bear who couldn't find his hat. I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. It was my Aunt Carol, my mother's older sister, calling from her landline in Burlington. She said she needed to talk to me about something. She told me that my mother had been diagnosed with early-stage Parkinson's disease 6 months earlier. She said my father's commercial cleaning business had lost its 2 biggest contracts over the winter, and they were struggling financially. She said my mother had been crying and saying she'd made a terrible mistake. And then she said, "Claire, I think they want to reconnect." I sat with that for a long moment. "Why are they having you call me?" I asked. She was quiet. Then she said, "Because they didn't think you'd pick up for them." And the thing was, she was right. I thanked her and said I'd think about it, and hung up. Then I sat in my car outside the hospital where I worked and just breathed for a while. Here's what I thought about. I thought about February. I thought about standing on that porch with no coat on. I thought about Callum, driving an hour in the snow, without hesitating. I thought about 11 months on a pull-out couch. I thought about Nora's face. And what I was going to teach her about family. About forgiveness. About what it means to be left behind. I didn't call my parents back. Not yet. What I did do was consult a family lawyer. I know that sounds extreme, but I'd worked in healthcare long enough to understand that when people reappear in your life, after years of silence, and they happen to be facing financial difficulty and health challenges, it's worth being careful. I needed to understand where I stood. The lawyer, a woman named Diane, who had a small office in downtown Hamilton and a very direct manner that I appreciated, walked me through everything. She told me that Derek, Nora's father, had never signed anything, never acknowledged paternity, and had therefore never paid a single dollar of child support. Which I already knew. But what I didn't fully understand was that this was retroactive. If I pursued it, I could claim back support going back to Nora's birth. She laid out the numbers. Based on Derek's documented income as an accountant, a court could reasonably award somewhere around $1. 400 to $1. 600 per month. And back support could realistically reach $55. 000 to $60. 000, depending on how it was calculated. I had never pursued it because I had never wanted to have to deal with him again. But sitting in that office, thinking about Callum's pull-out couch, and the shifts I'd worked, and the frozen vegetables, I thought that money belongs to Nora. It was always hers. Diane filed the application. In the meantime, I found a 2-bedroom apartment in the East End of Hamilton. First and last was tight, but I had enough saved. I moved out of Callum's place on a Saturday in June, with Nora on my hip and a U-Haul that Callum had rented and mostly packed himself. When I tried to thank him properly, the real thank you, the one I'd been working up to for 2.5 years, I managed about 4 words before I completely fell apart. He just hugged me for a long time and didn't say anything. When we finally pulled apart, he looked embarrassed and said, "You would have done the same for me." I told him I hoped I'd never have to find out. He laughed. Biscuit, who had finally warmed up to me after about 18 months, meowed from his carrier in the back seat. The new apartment was small, but it was mine. Nora had her own room. I painted it yellow on a Sunday afternoon while she napped. And when she woke up and saw it, she said yellow with such absolute delight that I had to sit down on the floor because my legs felt like they'd stopped working. It was the right color. 3 weeks after I moved in, I came home from a late shift to find a manila envelope tucked under my door. Inside was a card. A card. Not even a letter. One of those generic thinking of you cards from the drugstore, and inside the card was my mother's handwriting. She said she was sorry. She said she'd been wrong. She said she thought about Nora every day, and could we please talk? My father had signed his name underneath. Just his name. No message. I put the card on my kitchen counter and looked at it for 3 days. On the 4th day, I called my mother. I want to be clear about something. I called her on my terms. I was in my own apartment. In my own kitchen. With Nora asleep in her yellow room, down the hall. I was not afraid. I was not hoping for anything in particular. I just needed to hear what she had to say. My mother cried almost immediately. She said she'd been so ashamed. Not of me, she said, but of herself. She said she'd convinced herself that cutting contact was the right thing, that it would push me to handle the situation. I heard the quotation marks around that phrase, even if she didn't use them, and that when she understood I was going to have the baby and raise her, she hadn't known how to come back from what she'd said and done. She said she'd made it worse by waiting, and then worse again by waiting longer. She said she knew she didn't deserve anything from me. I said, "Tell me one thing. Was there any part of it that was ever about Nora, or was it always about you and Dad and what people would think?" She didn't answer right away. When she did, she said, "At first it was about us. About what we thought we'd taught you, and what we thought it said about us. But Claire, I've regretted it every single day." I believed her. That's the strange thing. I believed she meant it. But meaning it isn't the same as it being enough. I told her that I would not be rushed. I told her that any relationship with Nora would have to be built slowly, on Nora's timeline, and that I reserved the right to stop it at any point if I felt it wasn't good for her. I told her I wasn't interested in performing forgiveness for anyone's benefit. I told her that the person who had held this family together for the past 3 years was Callum. And that before anything else, my parents owed him a real apology, not a card. Not an email. A real one. To his face. My mother said yes to all of it. My father asked to speak to me toward the end of the call. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I didn't ask where you were going to sleep that night. That's something I have to live with." That was it. That was his apology. It wasn't pretty or eloquent, and it clearly cost him something to say it. Which, from my father, is actually a great deal. I said, "I know. We didn't hug it out. We didn't schedule a big family reunion. I didn't tell them they were forgiven. Because I wasn't sure that was true yet, and I wasn't going to say it, just because it was easier. What I did was leave the door open, a small door, with conditions. And at my pace, 3 months later, Derek's legal process concluded. The child support order came through at $1,520 per month. And the back support calculation, nearly 3 years' worth, came to $3,000. Diane called me on a Wednesday afternoon, and I sat on the floor of my kitchen to take the note because I wasn't sure my knees would hold. That money was Nora's. I put a large portion of it into an RESP for her education. I paid off the small amount of credit card debt I'd accumulated in those early years. And then I did something I'd been thinking about since the day I moved out of Callum's apartment. I called him. I told him I had some money, and I wanted to use it to do something for him. He tried to deflect immediately. I cut him off. I said, "Callum, you slept on a couch for 11 months. You rearranged your entire life. You drove an hour in a snowstorm to pick me up from a Tim Hortons. You are not deflecting this time." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I could use a new laptop." I laughed so hard I scared Nora, who came running in from the living room to see what was happening. I helped him with the deposit on a bigger apartment, a 2-bedroom, so he could finally have a proper office. I bought him the laptop. I took him to dinner at a restaurant he'd been talking about for 2 years, and I paid actually dadder. And when he tried to reach for the bill, I put my hand over his and said, "Please. Please let me do this one thing." Haletme. Nora calls him Uncle Cal. She loves him with the specific intensity that small children reserve for the people who have always, without exception, shown up. She doesn't know the whole story yet. She's 3. But she knows that when Uncle Cal walks through the door, everything is good. She knows that his apartment smells like biscuit and that he always has the right snacks. She knows that he taught her how to jump in puddles properly, and that he will read the Bear book 12 times in a row without complaint. She'll know the rest when she's older. My parents have met Nora 4 times now. Supervised visits. Which I know sounds clinical. But I needed it to feel that way. At least at first. My mother is quieter than I remembered, and moves more carefully now. She held Nora on the first visit, like she was something fragile, and almost dropped her own dignity. Instead, her eyes went so wide and emotional that even I had to look away. My father sat across the room and watched and barely said a word. Afterward, in the parking lot, he stopped me before I put Nora in the car seat. He looked at her for a long moment, and then he said, "She looks like you did." Just that? I'm not going to tell you that everything is repaired. Because it isn't. Trust is not a light switch. There are phone calls I still don't return right away. There are things that were said and things that weren't said that I think about at 2 in the morning sometimes. There are days when I feel the February cold like it just happened. But there are also Sunday mornings, when Nora climbs into my bed at 7 a.m. and presses her forehead against mine, and says, "Mama. Today, meaning. What are we doing? Who are we seeing? What is the adventure?" And I think about the parking lot. I think about the frozen vegetables and the pull-out couch and Callum's fishing magazine in the waiting room. I think about Patricia, the nurse, and the bear book, and the yellow paint. I think this is the life that got built from the wreckage of the other one. And it's a good life. It's a genuinely good life. That's not nothing. That's everything.